Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, but also Buddha have kind of spoke of life as suffering. Do you think there's truth to that? That suffering is a fundamental part of life.
I think it is a fundamental part of life. I don't think that means that life is suffering, right? If we say, well, life is suffering, then what am I doing? Then I'm trying to erase from my mind like the birth of my children, right? Like things that were filled with joy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like life is not entirely suffering, but life brings a lot of suffering. And for some people, it brings such disproportionate suffering, and the people don't survive the suffering. And I think when people are conscientious and empathic, that really bothers us, right? The suffering in our own lives and the fact that others at times could seem to be so overwhelmed by suffering that they don't even get a chance to see good. And I think that I do think there's truth to that, and there's sadness and distress to that. But to say, therefore, life is suffering, I think is just completely untrue. And, it ignores the fact that someone even made a trombone, right? Let alone that there's a little bit out of sync and someone's playing the trombone. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's cool. There's elements of the absurd that you said are neat and interesting. And if we start accepting that we can't understand or control everything, then we can accept and I think really love and foster the beauty in our lives.
Yeah, I think the word suffering is doing a little bit too much work, because I think it's probably referring to the philosophical concept of that. That it's absurd, the absurdity.
Right.
That stuff just happens randomly. Evil people succeed, good people fail.
Right.
There's a seeming random injustice on occasion.
Right.
And on occasion there's justice. And all of it that feels like, and maybe because often there's a lot of loss, and then there's a kind of matching complementary aspect to any good feeling that all comes crashing down, like every hello,
Right.
from a physics perspective, ends in a goodbye.
Uh-huh.
Like that's a really sad thing. Like I've all the amazing people I get to meet in my life, all the amazing experiences, eventually they have to end, and that's part of what makes them amazing.
But why is that sad? Is it because we're taught to think that it's like, look, at some point you and I are going to say goodbye today. Like, I hope we're richer for it. And then we take that goodness off with us. Like, I want to celebrate that because it's all part of the goodness. I think we're taught to think, oh, that's so bad. And it equates to death and misery. And I think it's often not that way.
I think there is a sadness to it, but I also don't think that sadness is a negative thing. It's a different way to celebrate a beautiful thing. So there's a melancholic nature to it. There's something passing of it leaving. I mean, it's that old Louis C.K. thing that I go back to over and over from his show Louis, where he was all heartbroken that he just broke up, with somebody he loved. And he told about that to an old man. And the old man said, you're a fool. That's the best part. I missed that part where you sort of are lingering in that loss. You're feeling the pain of that loss because that lasts the longest. It's the most intense. It's the most reliable. And it's a kind of celebration of the love you had. Like losing the love is still a celebration of the love. I think you don't want to over romanticize that, but there's some aspect of truth to that. Like that melancholic feeling of remembering a beautiful time that's no longer there is a kind of celebration of it, and is a kind of joyful experience, even though it's very easy to experience it as a negative emotion. I think it's just like you said. I mean, it's up to our mind to determine how that emotion is really felt. But it's a tricky one because it's like heartbreak to experience that as a positive thing.
People can reminisce at funerals, right? And laugh because people can be very, very, very sad and perceive that this person has died and perceive the sadness of it. But in perceiving that and really living in it, then you can have people who want to remember that person by like telling a funny story. Why? Because each of those people carries that with them. So I think what you're saying is consistent with healthy function as human beings, because we're going to encounter sadness and loss. Like, what do we do with that? Right? And do we do things that ultimately create some redemption or even reparation inside of us? And like reparation's a big word in psychology, right? It's how we repair damage and loss. So if we lose someone and we're sad, can we, by telling funny stories about that person, remind ourselves that, hey, they're still inside of us, whether they're out there looking at me, I don't know, but I can call that person to mind inside of us. And then we have something that's good and beautiful that comes of that too.